Hello, everyone. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the CDR Summit 2023. The first session will be an intro, which I'll introduce very shortly. The second will be with our partners at Breakthrough Energy, who have organized a great session on the policy questions. And then the third will be a business leadership session where you can get to know four of our business leaders who will be on stage. The idea is that you really kind of understand who we are as a community and what we care about and why we're in this business. So if you're new to CDR, which is some of you, but probably not very many yet, we want you to come away with your basic questions about CDR answered, but we also want you to leave with more questions. And we want you to go away thinking that this is very exciting and you'd love to learn more and you'd love to be more involved in CDR. And so, we'd love to carry on having a relationship with you and be able to engage with you and enrich the public debate about carbon removals. So just some housekeeping questions, first of all. So this event is live streamed on our website and social media. And so by attending, you are agreeing to being captured on camera. If you can choose to sit in a designated area where the camera does not capture you, and I think Alina's going to point to where that designated area is. That's on the side there beyond the column, so if you don't want to be captured. Secondly, there will be a Twitter wall on the screens, which you can use by sharing your thoughts, and you can use that with the hashtag CDR Summit. With that said, I'm delighted to be able to introduce to you our two keynote speakers, ELI Mitchell-LARSON and PRESTON ARAGONÈS. I hope that's pronounced properly. I'm more confident with Mitchell-LARSON than I am with ARAGONÈS. And these two guys are going to give you what we hope will be a really engaging and exciting introduction to carbon removals. Mark is a policy manager at Bellona, the Norwegian climate NGO, where he's been for 5 years. He's been engaged in the NEGEM H 2020 project since 2019 or 2020 and is leading the work package on European and international governance. He's been coordinating Bellona's CDR work since then across their offices in Norway and Germany, and his main ambition in the field has been to make people understand the need for CDR as well as the limits to its deployment, trying to straddle the line between the hype and over-caution. Eli is the Chief Science and Advocacy Officer and co-founder of Carbon Gap. Carbon Gap is an independent, philanthropically funded non-profit organization focused on responsibly scaling up carbon dioxide removal in Europe. That was very smooth. As an important complement to emissions reductions. They work across all carbon removal methods, bringing the best technical expertise to inform European policymaking. Their efforts are focused in Brussels, with additional staff in France, Switzerland, and the UK. Eli is an associate at Oxford Net Zero at the University of Oxford, and prior to establishing Carbon Gap, he's advised companies on net zero strategies and responsible carbon removal procurement, and he was COO of Sun Farmer, which was a social enterprise that designs, deploys, and finances solar installations in Nepal. So with that breathless introduction, welcome to Mark and Eli on stage. Let me just grab you a microphone.
Thank you, Chris. Wow, that was one of the deeper cut bios I've heard in a long time. Thank you, Chris. And thank you to the Negative Emissions Platform for having us here today. Thank you for the introduction. We can skip through that. We have the enviable or unenviable task, I don't know which, of the intro talk about what is CDR. And I see a lot of familiar faces in the room, so hopefully this won't be too redundant for you. But what we hope is, whether you're new to CDR or you've been in the carbon management community for a while, we're going to give you slightly new creative ways to think about the what, the why, and the how of carbon removal. So kind of useful conceptual building blocks that you can use in your work in the carbon management space to communicate even better. Oh, there we go. So the what, the why, and the how of carbon removal. A little delay here, but I'll vamp while we're waiting for the slides to advance. The what of carbon removal. What is carbon removal? You've heard it before. I hope. But carbon removal is any activities that remove CO2 from the atmosphere or ocean and store it durably in geological, terrestrial, or ocean reservoirs or in products, so says the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And of course, that means it's a wide array of methods, some of which we haven't even unveiled as of yet.
So what is carbon dioxide removal if we look at some of the components of carbon dioxide removal once this loads?
Try pointing here? Okay, maybe, yeah.
So at Bellona, we've taken to using these 4 principles developed by Samantha Tanzer in 2019 to define, to use as the guiding principles to define carbon dioxide removal. So there's these 4 principles which I'll break down now and talk to you about. So the first one is that CO2 is physically extracted from the atmosphere. There's a next slide somewhere. Where do I point? Okay. The first principle is that CO2 has to be physically extracted from the atmosphere. And so here I've taken 3 typical examples that we'd see in the CDR community. Biomass with CCS, direct air capture and storage, and forestation type projects. What we're talking about here is extracting the CO2 from the air with photosynthesis via biomass for both forestation and biomass with CCS style projects, or extraction via chemicals for direct air capture. Sorry, the slides are going forward a bit too quickly. The second principle is that the extracted CO2 has to be permanently stored. And so if I could go back, it would be nice, but unfortunately I can't. There it is. For CCS projects, we're storing that carbon in geological formations. With forestation projects, we're storing it in the biomass itself. Thanks. And with direct air capture and storage projects, we're storing it in geology. So effectively, storing that carbon in different types, making sure that that CO2 stays away from the atmosphere for as long as possible. Eli will go later on a bit further into how we can break down this concept of permanence. The next principle is equally important and often ignored, is that all greenhouse gas emissions associated with the removal and storage processes must be comprehensively estimated and included. So here what this means is all of the emissions from the extraction of the resources, the energy that was used to power the processes, the mining, the transport emissions, all of this. This needs to be included into the emission balance of any project that is doing carbon dioxide removal if we want to achieve the desired outcome, which is the 4th principle, that more atmospheric CO2 has to be permanently removed from the atmosphere than we are emitting greenhouse gases in the process of doing so. It's a little bit, it's in a way quite simple. We just need to be taking out more than we're putting in, because otherwise that defies the whole purpose.
Next slide. So I think we're advancing this way.
Yeah, so what happens if we apply these principles and we look at where the CO2 comes from and where it goes, so the first 2 principles as screening criteria, what is not CDR becomes quite clear. So this is a CCU project. The CO2 originally came from the geological store. We've used it once in an industrial installation, captured it, used it, and in this example, used it to make fuels. We combust the fuel, the CO2 goes into the atmosphere. That's a flow of carbon from the geosphere to the atmosphere. That's very clearly an emission. There might be some climate benefit in there, but it's not removals. The second example, a typical CCS project. So we've extracted carbon from the geosphere, we've used it once in the industrial installation, we capture that CO2 before it reaches the atmosphere, put it back in the ground. The CO2 doesn't come from the atmosphere, it has been permanently stored, it's still not removals. That's very clear. And now the final example, here I've taken the example of a bio-CCS project. It could also apply to DAX, could also apply to afforestation. But the point is, the CO2 originates from the atmosphere via the biomass, is captured with the biomass, is then used in the industrial installation. We capture the CO2 before it gets to the atmosphere, permanently stored. It comes from the atmosphere, it's permanently stored. That process can be carbon dioxide removal, provided it meets the 3rd principle, of course. But This visualization here, I always found a very useful way to see when we might be doing carbon dioxide removal and when we're very, very clearly not.
Next slide. I'll try to just indicate, that way we can go faster. So this is just another way of thinking about exactly what Mark just explained. And it's tricky, right? Here we are in Brussels, where a lot of us speak with Brussels stakeholders all the time. And again, we get this confusion between carbon capture, carbon removal, carbon capture utilization. The trick is that they're all asking different questions. CCU asks, does it have monetary value? CDR asks, did it come from the atmosphere, did it go into storage? And CCS asks, does it happen to utilize a specific set of capture and storage technologies, geological storage? So they don't really exist in the same logic space, and yet people confuse these terms, so we have to work to disambiguate them. On the next slide, we just wanted to make the point that putting it all together, of course, there's also this way of looking at the kind of modularity of the steps in a full chain carbon dioxide removal method or process. So first you have to extract the CO2, then you have the conversion step, where that carbon is converted to a storable format. Think about combusting biomass into CO2 or converting biomass into non-labile, pyrolyzed biochar components. You have a transport step and you have a storage step, and you can really mix and match these. And that's, I think, another important kind of conceptual underpinning to share with stakeholders, that we can get creative and find all the different ways of delivering those. Next slide. And so this is an illustration we commissioned just to kind of help highlight to a non-specialist audience that the entirety of our physical geography is available to us to find ways of taking CO2 out of the air and storing it. And that includes geological storage, ocean CDR, et cetera. On the next slide, we wanted to zoom in and say, for our work as advocates and civil society representatives, we have to be really careful that we don't describe any carbon removal methods normatively in terms of being better or worse than one another. And that's probably familiar to the members of the Negative Emissions Platform. Rather, they all have various strengths and weaknesses, and we need to compare them against those criteria. One criterion we wanted to zoom in on is this permanence and durability ambiguity, because we have an IPCC definition, which hopefully will be enshrined in the CRCF, we'll see, which defines carbon removal as the storage, carbon stored durably. We also have a lot of people talking about the permanence of carbon storage. And so we just wanted to zoom in on this and try to disambiguate it. And these are our ideas. This isn't backed up by the IPCC, but I think it's a really useful way of differentiating. And that is to say that permanence is really an ideal case. Nothing is actually permanent, right? Even very long-lived geological stored carbon, someday in the distant future, it will likely be released. And so really, permanence is really just an ideal reference case that we compare actual carbon storage to. Whereas I think durability is a really useful term to describe something that's really just a statement of fact. It is the estimate of the reversal risk of a given piece of carbon storage. Now, how do we know that reversal risk? Sometimes we have historical data, often we don't. Sometimes we have lab experiments, and sometimes we have modeling. But we do our best to estimate the risk of reversal, and then we can plot that and look at the expected residence time, which is how long we hope the carbon will stay stored. And this is a very idealized chart because, of course, a reversal risk doesn't just stay the same over time. But if you did have an average reversal risk of 10%, then on average, you'd expect that carbon to remain stored for 10 years, 1%, 100 years, and so on. But the key here is that describing one form of carbon removal, like forestation, as less durable than another doesn't mean that it's worse. It just means you rely on different mechanisms to keep that climate benefit secure. Those mechanisms might be legal, they might be financial, they will certainly involve human systems trying to keep that carbon stored and make sure somebody's liable if something goes wrong. So they're valuable, but they're inherently riskier than actually more durable carbon storage, which is geochemically fixed. In the next slide, we're just repeating the chart of different characteristic timescales from the State of CDR report, which itself is sourcing from the IPCC, just to highlight that this is an active area of further definition about what these reversal risks actually are. But we hope that's useful in your work to think about the difference between these two terms and how they can actually mean different things, or we can use them to help enhance people's understanding. Now we'll move on to the next slide. The why of carbon dioxide removal. Thank you. Mark?
And next slide again, please.
Why do we need to remove carbon?
Exactly. So this is a question that we've been asking ourselves a lot in the NGO community. And I think this graph visualizes that quite well. We've basically not been cutting emissions anywhere near as fast as we should be. This graph shows the rate at which we could have been cutting emissions if we'd started earlier. And we see, obviously, the curve gets steeper and steeper as we fail to cut emissions but keep the same temperature goal. Now, this graph doesn't have removals in it, but you know that's a pretty intimidating graph to look at. But so effectively, we haven't been cutting emissions fast enough, and the more we lag behind, the more we need to cut, the more we will need removals, and the harder the discussion gets. So effectively, you know, this gets back to the point of we need to be cutting emissions as quickly as possible. We cannot avoid that part of the discussion. That's an asterisk that needs to go at the start of any conversation on removals. Next slide, please. Also, we need to recognize carbon dioxide removal is unavoidable. And those are the words from the latest IPCC report. This is a stylized version of what they published earlier this year, which outlines 3 sequential roles for carbon dioxide removal, which we can see as before net zero, at net zero, and after net zero. Now, before net zero, what we need is for carbon dioxide removal to accelerate our climate action. So this very much needs to sit on top of emission reduction plans. At net zero, this is where we have a double carbon neutral or climate neutral outcome. So we see the dotted line is carbon neutral, the straight line is climate neutral. We will need carbon dioxide removal to balance out residual CO2 emissions that we don't know how to get rid of, or don't want to, or are, you know, it's too expensive, and to balance out those non-CO2 emissions as well, that for the same reason we can't get rid of. The key distinction here being that the European Union has a 2050 climate neutral target, which implies that we need to be carbon neutral before then. So before 2050, we'll need to be carbon neutral. Sounds a bit scary. The final role for removals is eventually we need to be removing more CO2 from the atmosphere than we're actually adding, and then we can start hopefully drawing down concentrations down to less unmanageable levels, knowing that there's no manageable level of CO2 concentrations. Next slide, please. Yeah, again, sorry. Now, why does the IPCC talk so much about CDR? I'm sure many of you have seen this graph before. It's from the special report on 1.5, which I think many people could credit as where the CDR conversation really kicked off. This was sort of 2019. Everyone from that point on has been talking about removals in the policy space. So the IPCC scenarios often come out with very big headline numbers. So we see large ranges from we need 100 to 1,000 gigatons of CO2 to be removed by the end of the century. Now, that's a very large range, firstly. And secondly, those numbers are taken from integrated assessment models. These are economic optimization models. They tend to make relatively simple decisions and take often imperfect assumptions. We can't, that's just the way it works. They're helpful in their own way, but they're not prescriptive. Now, what happens in these models is we often see a very large degree of BECCS, which here is seen in yellow. We see that pop out quite a lot in the P3 and P4 scenarios, which are a bit more pessimistic. We see much more emissions, much more use of fossil fuels, much less emission cuts in the beginning. But the reason these models gravitate towards BECCS so much is that BECCS provides energy and removals at the same time, and the models love that because it's cheaper to do that than to deploy more renewables. They can just fix 2 problems at once, and that's that. So often the numbers are just portrayed, they're taken at face value, and we don't really scratch under the bonnet. What I'm trying to say is that the IPCC scenarios often don't include a lot of the real-life constraints that we might see, such as biomass supply. we saw that the latest IPCC report included a biomass limit of 300 exajoules, whereas the IEA takes a much more constrained 100 exajoules. Now, that obviously affects the rate at which we can remove carbon. The point is, all of these numbers reflect a need for carbon dioxide removal, but they don't necessarily reflect how much we can actually remove in real life. And that's something that we need to be very cautious of. Next slide. The thing I do want you to remember, though, is that there's 3 roles, and these are the roles, and we need to make sure that we cut emissions as much as possible, that removals sit on top of emission reductions in the meantime, and that later on, those can be used to balance out residual emissions and can then be used to turn back time, if you can call it that.
Great. So we've talked about, if you move on to the next slide, the what of carbon removal. What is it? What are the key components that you need to understand and you need to communicate? Mark's gone over the why. Why is it unequivocal that we need very large volumes of carbon removal to meet our climate goals? And what are the specific use cases? Now we're going to talk about the how and get into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty on how we use carbon removal on the next slide. And soon I'll just ask you to keep advancing. So it's also worth thinking about the kind of subtleties between a negative carbon flux, so just observing a flow of CO2 that comes from the atmosphere into a carbon stock, and the second piece, which Mark has described, what is carbon removal? Because, of course, carbon removal is only the portion of that negative flux that we can attribute to human action. It's also only the portion that can be secured for long-term storage, and it's the portion that's net of associated emissions. So if you like, carbon removal, you can think of as kind of a subset of an overall negative emission. And you could go even deeper. You could say that carbon removal and a negative carbon flux they are physical things we can observe in the real world. We can look at it and we can measure it. But a climate benefit is something we've created as humans. It exists in our world of carbon accounting. And the key about a climate benefit is somebody's going to claim that climate benefit, and they're going to do something with it. On the next slide, I want to draw your attention to, well, first, the sort of 3 different types of climate benefit that Mark went over in the beginning. Of course, we're only talking about the removal piece, and it's really just that net portion on the end. On the next slide, you can see in simple terms that really, removal is the only of the 3 climate benefits that actually has a physical flux of carbon that can be measured. That's an advantage, really, over the legacy carbon market and the legacy carbon project types, which really need to, go the way, phase out and hopefully disappear relatively soon, and find other models for financing. On the next slide, we want to make this very clear distinction between the 2 types of claims that somebody can make with this climate benefit. So someone can make a contribution claim, and that means that some amount of carbon has been removed, someone has financed that removal, and the only thing they can claim is that their contribution created that climate benefit. So there needs to be additionality, there needs to be proper MRV, but they're not doing anything with it, right? And so that's kind of the safest form of claim, because that's a way of getting the carbon removal industry going. It's the way of generating benefit for the environment and the climate, but it doesn't undermine any other activities or any other emissions. On the right, we have something trickier, and I'll ask you to just advance maybe once every 5 or so seconds. So a compensation claim is when somebody actually purchases carbon credits, purchases that carbon removal, if you will, or purchases the climate benefit, and they say that that's actually compensating for some emission that they've had. So they're claiming to neutralize. And of course, when we compensate, the thing we're compensating for needs to be equal and opposite to the damage we're doing. And there are some tricky things with that, especially here in Brussels when we're needing to make the case to policymakers that this can work, because there are a lot of bad compensation claims out there. One note to make is that climate damages are often nonlinear. So it's important when we're communicating that we don't say that a compensation claim is one and done. There are some damages to the environment that can't be reversed. So carbon removal shouldn't be thought of as a complete and perfect reverse and neutralization of an emission. And second, it really matters which emissions are being compensated for. So a negative flux doesn't care, but in the world of accounting, you have to say which unit of removal is matched against which emission. And it matters which emissions. Are those emissions truly difficult to decarbonize, or are they much easier? And finally, we need to look at which removals are being used to claim that compensation. So on the next slide, we want to highlight the fact that this really ties back to the concept of net zero and how we need to get to net zero, but not all net zeros are the same. Here we see what's happening today. We're dumping carbon in the atmosphere at an alarming rate. A lot of it's going into the land and ocean biosphere, but not enough. And none of it's going back into the geosphere, practically. Advance, please. And again, what you see on the right is net zero. It's a state in which we're still emitting carbon to the atmosphere, albeit less, and a lot of carbon's going into the biosphere to counteract that. So the same amount of carbon's going into the atmosphere as is going into the biosphere. That is net zero. It is a balance of emissions and removals, but it is not a stable net zero state. It is essentially the act of converting fossil fuels into trees, which we cannot do forever, right? There's only a certain amount of space in the biosphere to accommodate that, and we're basically stacking up that risk, and we're asking a lot of nature. So when we advance once more, we'll see that this concept of durable net zero, sometimes referred to as geological net zero, where we're balancing both sinks. We're thinking distinctly about the geosphere and about the biosphere, because going back to this concept of durability, some forms of carbon storage are innately more secure than others. So it's important that we actually achieve two balances, a balance between the carbon coming out of the geosphere, the fossil fuels we extract, with removals that store carbon back in that same place, as well as a balance in the biosphere. So however much carbon we're emitting in the biosphere, we need to be storing more than that. And we need to stabilize and grow the natural carbon stock. On the next slide, just to hammer home this point, that what this means for compensation claims is you can only compensate for fossil fuel emissions with permanent geochemically bound storage. And really, you can only reasonably compensate for emissions from the biosphere with restoration and storage in the biosphere. That's a really key point that I hope we're on the cusp of getting across in the Brussels policy ecosystem and beyond. Next slide, please.
So how should we regulate carbon dioxide removal then? Firstly, as I've said repeatedly, we need to establish ambitious emission reduction targets. That goes without saying almost. On top of that, we need an additional separate carbon dioxide removal target that is also separate. So we need to manage the land and the geological sinks separately. So I'm now talking 3 different targets: emission reduction target, carbon removal target, split into land sink target and permanent geological target. And at the same time, we need to regulate and clarify net zero claims. Back to the point that Eli made about compensation claims, to make sure that we're only balancing emissions that could not otherwise have been abated with the right type of removal. And that's the only way to really make a proper net zero claim. Next slide, please. And so this is our closing point, is that there's often a lot of, I guess, conflict, or not necessarily conflict, but debate, which is sometimes unnecessary in the CDR space. There's some very optimistic views, there's some very pessimistic views, and I think it's important to recognize that there is a middle ground. It is there, and I think personally, I think what is missing is ability to have the right policy framework in place that can address both concerns. So within those who are very positive and those who are very negative, I think we all agree here that we need to cut emissions as quickly as possible, and that is the priority. We also recognize that we need carbon dioxide removal, and we also agree that both need to happen in parallel. They can't eat into each other. So we need to build a policy framework which accommodates for that.
Right, and I think what we've tried to convey with the what, the why, and the how of carbon removal is we're at the beginning of, we hope, a really concerted and rapid growth of the scale-up of carbon dioxide removal in a responsible way, right, as a complement to emission reduction. And as we do that, it's never been more important for us as a community and beyond to be able to talk about and communicate the fundamental issues on carbon dioxide removal. So we've got people that are optimistic, we've got people that are concerned. We need to reflect both, and we ourselves need to be those concerned individuals who worry about mitigation deterrence and engage with it urgently, who actually worry about tricky questions like defining what is hard to decarbonize. That's going to be a political challenge, and we think it needs to happen very, very soon, even if it's a bit scary. We need to actually focus on restoring ecosystems for their own sake. So even if we're working on higher durability carbon removal methods, it's important, I believe, as members of the climate struggle, to actually work as well to come up with new ways to finance the restoration of nature and terrestrial carbon sinks that don't rely on compensation, if that's no longer a viable means. So we hope, on the next slide, just to say that we hope you've enjoyed this rapid tour through a bunch of kind of conceptual building blocks. We hope you'll get in touch, and thank you again to Chris and Nep for having us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark and Eli. That was super interesting and fun. Great to have two of you on stage interacting. And so now I invite you to go back to your networking, go back to the stands where the companies, I think mainly in the other room, where the companies are displaying their various products and projects. Discuss, talk, learn, and see you back here at 3:30, which is almost 45 minutes away, so you can have a good long time to talk. Thank you.